Our second speaker is Danielle Stein, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Musicology here at the University of California, Los Angeles, one of our stellar graduate students. Her research focuses on World War II, musical propaganda, and the use of music in psychological operations in the United States. She works as the graduate student researcher of the Digital Humanities projects at the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience and serves as the assistant director of the UCLA Early, sorry, I got all verklempt thinking about the UCLA Early Music Ensemble, excuse me. So she will be speaking to us. Her paper is entitled Crossing Enemy Lines, Jewish Immigrant Artists and the United States Office of Strategic Services Clandestine Transnational Broadcasts. Please welcome Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the organizers for today. Thank you for all of your incredible work, especially in moving this event. And thank you so much, Joy, for the intro as well. Thank you. All right. On December 12th of 1941, as the United States prepared for entry into the Second World War, Kurt Weill, the Jewish German immigrant composer, wrote to Robert Sherwood, the playwright and future director of the Office of War Information, or OWI, about the possibility of employing the talents of Jewish, German, and Austrian immigrant artists in a series of, quote, cultural attacks administered through the radio against Germany. United States psychological operations would indeed take this form of transnational aggression against Germany in the years following Weill's impassioned plea. In 1944, Weill's recommendations moved from the purview of the OWI to the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, who began employing numerous Jewish and other exiled German and Austrian immigrant artists for clandestine recordings. One of these shrouded operations, the Muzak Project, initiated in 1944 by the OSS, had the sole purpose of crafting and broadcasting manipulated popular standards and Broadway tunes into strategic radio shows with weaponized intent via the Allied clandestine station Soldatensender Calais, a station which masqueraded as a soldier station for German soldiers and citizens. Utilizing Kurt Weill's and Rudolf Gur's arrangements and the familiar voices of Vilma Kure, Lotte Lenya, Marlene Dietrich, and other exiled artists, the OSS's Muzak Project delivered strategic messages and arrangements to targeted listeners with the intent to demoralize and sow discord. Gender and nostalgia became multifaceted tools of weaponization within these recordings, as the OSS drew on the intimacy of radio and the difficulties and absences of soldiers' lives in order to demoralize. Weill's envisioning and advocacy of a psychological warfare by mobilizing the talents of German Jewish immigrants in a cultural attack against the German people provided the OSS and ultimately the CIA, as Music Project debriefing reports were incorporated into CIA planning, with a template for future propaganda in what the intelligence offices deemed the wilderness of mirrors. A clandestine operation of this scale has left a considerable amount of historical material splintered across multiple archives and presents a series of challenges for analysis for the researcher. Utilizing a feminist approach or an anarchival approach as a way to index the invisible and bring together fractured materials, as Leah Brosgol has presented in Absent the Archive, I've traced these project documents through the Associated Secretaries files and receipts of the OSS, which has afforded access to new documentation that had formerly been removed from more direct operative personnel files. An analysis of recently declassified documents from the U.S. National Archive, CIA, and U.S. National Army Heritage Archive reveal how the OSS mined Jewish immigrants' performance and style in the development of United States subversive propaganda and weaponized music. In 1942, President Roosevelt formed the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, a precursor to the CIA, to coordinate espionage activities behind enemy lines. One branch of the OSS, Morale Operations, specialized in psychological warfare and regarded music as a means to infiltrate the minds of soldiers and civilians while, quote, paralyzing the fingers that pull the triggers, end quote, as stated in archival MO planning records. An early conception of no-touch warfare, the Muzak project, introduced by Morale Operations, had the sole purpose of creating and broadcasting weaponized recordings and radio shows designed to demoralize the German soldiers in public. This joint project between the British and United States War Offices was initiated in July 1944, when Ray Smith, head of London OSS in joint effort with the Political Warfare Executive, or PWE, requested that the OSS Washington, quote, deliver a flow of American songs with German lyrics, end quote. The songs were to be broadcast on the radio station Soldatensender Calais, which claimed to be a German soldier station broadcasting within occupied France. The station, in actuality, was located in the English town of Milton Bryan, where the PWE had built a highly advanced broadcasting and communications center complete with recording studios designed for the creation and dissemination of black propaganda. Highly camouflaged, the secured facility housed the most powerful broadcast transmitter in the world and could easily broadcast to all of Central Europe and surrounding U-boats. Broadcasts were scheduled nightly between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. the following morning. Officially in operation from October 24, 1943 to April 30, 1945, the PWE radio programs initially included real sports news and slightly altered but believable war news. However, nearing 1944, heads of MO in England began to express concerns about holding the interest of the German troops, requesting that the Washington office, quote, produce on a large scale the best that American music had to offer, and to create German lyrics which would hold the enemy's attention, end quote. Other stipulations for the performances were cabled to the Washington office, quote, our voices must have foreign character, we cannot have American accents, but typical American arrangements are in order. For example, Harry James with good German lyric and pure Austrian or North German voice, end quote. These caveats were necessary preconditions for camouflaging the recordings. The dualistic nature of the transformed songs proved challenging. Not only did they have to lure dial twisters and hold the attention of the soldiers, but many also had to serve as insurrectionary propaganda. The integrity of the station's camouflage was paramount, as listening to enemy stations in Nazi Germany was regarded as treason. To maintain the listener's attention and avoid suspicion, the altered news stories and lyrics had to be believable and subtle. M.O. Washington, after several investigations, hired Viennese lyricist Lothar Metzel. Originally from Austria, Metzel had fled Vienna for New York and was working as a writer in Broadway and off-Broadway productions. Metzel, a member of the Little Art Theater, or the Kleinkunstbühne, which we just saw, in Vienna, had reunited with fellow immigrant artists in New York and formed the Refugee Artist Group, where he co-produced and supplied lyrics for the performances of From Vienna and Reunion in New York, both created to showcase the talents of Viennese Jewish refugees. The privately funded Resistance series featured satirical political sketches and blended Broadway musical stylings with nostalgic Viennese songs. Having recently received positive coverage in the press, Metzel was a favorable fit for the specific needs of the OSS. Once hired, Metzel began working German propaganda lyrics into a series of hits pulled from Variety and also from recent Broadway show tunes, and later into sentimental love songs and nostalgic ballads, as these pieces were most exclusively performed by the women on the project. So the arrangements for the music were provided by Arnold Schoenberg student Rudolf Gurr, also brother to the composer Walter Gurr, who was working in the U.S. Army at the time of his transfer to the OSS. Additional arrangements were provided by Kurt Weill, more specifically for large multimedia campaigns. Collectively, these manipulated tunes had a large effect on lowering morale as they highlighted the contrast between the happy past and the precarity of the present, as is reported in German and Austrian POW accounts. OSS Washington gave the project the codename Muzak. The Muzak codename was short for musical action. However, it was also a nod to the Muzak Recording Company located in New York, where most of the OSS recordings were completed. These sessions were conducted under the utmost secrecy. Much was at stake if the true nature of the recordings was revealed. This included large copyright infringements, as the OSS never sought permission for the use and revision of the selected popular songs. The OSS's cover was maintained through the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, who created a dummy organization, the Mohawk Trading Corporation, to hire and engage the artist. Through the J. Walter Thompson Agency, MO began engaging orchestras, musicians, and directors and renting studio and recording space. Artists engaged included Kurt Weill, Walter Mehring, and Lotte Lenya, recruited for specific Muzak recording projects that coincided with printed material operations. However, for the majority of Muzak's 312-song output, music was provided by members of the NBC House Orchestra, varying between an 8 to 14-person band conducted by Irving Miller. The budget for the project was meager, with $2,100 allotted for the first recording session and a budget of $900 a session thereafter. The Thompson Agency negotiated lower rates with the musicians' unions for the artist by touting the work as part of the war effort. The union was told that the recordings were part of the U.S. propaganda operation Voice of America broadcast. However, it was never revealed to the artists that they were creating music for the OSS and a black radio station. For the singers, the Thompson Agency turned to Jewish, German-speaking immigrants whom they invited for auditions in New York City. Several stars were recruited: Marlene Dietrich's daughter, Maria Manton, German baritone John Hendrick, Herta Glatz from the Vienna Opera, German recording star Greta Keller, Metropolitan Opera singers Jarmila Novotna and Greta Stockhold, nightclub singer Vilma Cure, who was also a member of the Refugee Artist Group, and comedian Sig Arno. Between July 1944 and April 1945, the Muzak Company produced 312 recordings on 16-inch unbreakable vinylite discs. Recordings were sent to Milton Bryan in early July of 1944, with successful results returned, and budgets were increased for the operation. Immediately following receipt of the first recordings, the London OSS Morale Operations Office telegrammed, "Metzel's lyrics are splendid." In crafting the new lyrics to seamlessly fit American rhythms while conforming to the German public's taste, Metzel employed a poetic technique that blurred the separation between innocent rhymes and subversive verse. OSS memos dictated lyric techniques for enemy demoralization, which included appealing to homesickness, loneliness, anxiety, especially over wives' or girlfriends' possible infidelity at home, and wartime weariness and discontent. There was a whole printed media campaign to go along with that anxiety called the Lonely Broken Hearts Club. So if you're interested in seeing what those materials are like, we have pictures of those. So for security reasons, sympathetic appeals were privileged by the Muzak Project and paired with sentimentality within lyrics and radio scripts. When writing for a male performer, Metzel's lyrics were cutting and often made allusions to Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as in the American song Hallelujah, sung by John Hendrick. Metzel wrote, "Satan's leading the government, so take advice, throw him out." We'll listen to a little bit of that here.
Satan führt den Staat an, nimm den Rat an, wirf ihn raus. Sing Halleluja, Halleluja, und der Friede zieht ins Haus.
Noting the potentials of radio as a tool for access, an OSS interoffice memo states, quote, "The great trump card of black radio is intimacy, one of the best methods of subversive activities," end quote. From the intimacy of radio, the Muzak team favored the craft of sentimental and nostalgic ballads performed by women, where Metzel often made references to the peaceful past in contrast with the foreboding future. For example, the OSS reworking of Dietrich's Surrey with the Fringe on Top substitutes the Surrey and regional slang with a nostalgic winter scene and a troubled romantic relationship. The last verse displays the manipulative techniques and knife-twisting nostalgia employed by Metzel. Quote, "Sadly the ravens cry in the dark, let the white horse go slower, let me still have the illusion that I still see you in the sleigh with the bells in the valley, deep in the snow," end quote. We'll listen to this as well.
Ans Ende schon längst dieser Reise, traurig scheinen im Dunkeln die Raben, lass den Schimmel langsamer traben, lass die Illusion mich doch haben, dass ich dich noch seh, in dem Schlitten mit den Schellen und dem Tal, tief im Schnee.
Some of these selections came from the 1939 film Destry Rides Again, where Dietrich plays a dislocated cabaret artist. The OSS version of You've Got That Look remained an almost exact translation of the English version within the film. However, for the OSS reworking, the subtle lyric shifts were thought most effective when placed with Dietrich's signature temporal suspension, realized through a sudden shift into a lowered voice, more Sprechstimme or spoken section of her performance. This technique can be heard when the music cuts and Dietrich drops into her lower register to deliver the pointed lyrics on the line, Ich weiß, wehren sollt ich mich, doch ich kann's nicht. I know I should fight back, but I cannot. I'm so sorry. I thought we had a recording of this, but I'm not seeing it, so we'll move on without it for now. But perhaps when the questions, if I can find it, we can play it. Veiled as a reference to succumbing to sexual advances, the double entendre in the lyrics, purposed as a demoralization instrument, is striking, especially when taken literally. Coupled with Dietrich's unique use of voice as a site of illusory intimacy, as well as gender and sexual ambiguity, the newly penned lyrics took aim through capitalizing on the OSS's well-documented war weariness and historical memory, highlighting much of what is lost throughout war, including the musical artist. That many of these singers were recognized artists in their home country who had been exiled rendered many of these female performers a symbolic weapon. Their absence and their femininity are positioned to wound, and more specifically, to demoralize. Additionally, Metzel, Gurr, and Weil were tasked with lyrics and arrangements that contained concrete allusions to current military events, as in Greta Keller's presentation of I Am Like the West Wall, to the tune of Come With Me, My Honey, where the narrator's flirtation with fidelity is likened to the strength of the German West Wall. Keller croons, quote, I am like the West Wall. I won't fall under any circumstances. Yes, I am this way overall. I've just one message, please. Keep your hands off my knees. I am like the West Wall, end quote. From September 1944 to March 1945, the Siegfried Line, or West Wall, was subjected to a large-scale Allied offensive and fell in early 1945. German propaganda, both at home and abroad, repeatedly portrayed the West Wall as an impenetrable fortification. But once rendered vulnerable through Allied repeated attack, the Soldatensender began playing Keller's West Wall in repetition, along with other texts containing more pointed attacks of Nazi leadership. This veiled goading continued as the Muzak team developed a series of longer radio shows, cabaret in style, titled The Lightning Stage, or Die Blitzbühne. The format combined elements of commercial American shows with the content and style of presentation characteristic of pre-war Jewish, German, and Austrian cabaret. The show presented itself as naive improvisational theater staged before a public made up of Wehrmacht soldiers and officers. Coarse in tone and with an unvarnished style of humor, the artistic fanfare of this seemingly light-hearted cabaret was in reality meticulously contrived. As in the second script for the show, when a musical segment of the laughing song from Die Fledermaus is ironically interrupted in repetition by German news announcements of campaign successes, only to be answered with the laughing in the aria. All the performances were variations on the same theme of defeat. Here, from the same script, we see new lyrics penned for Offenbach's Can Can, announcing the end of the show, but in actuality, the double meanings of ending the war are left resounding through this last segment. The scripts for The Lightning Stage were written by Lothar Metzel. Alan Roth of NBC Radio served as the musical director, and Herbert Berghoff of the refugee artist group, Sig Arno, John Hendrick, and Lizzie Balla comprised the performers. In considering the effects of these recorded projects, OSS Morale Operations Agent Elizabeth McIntosh states that the main goal of these manipulated recordings, quote, we tried to make the German soldiers homesick, war-weary, want to give up, but the station was also heard in cities, and when it was, it also had a very demoralizing effect. To assess the effect, end quote, sorry. To assess the effectiveness of the Muzak project, OSS staff interrogated and conducted surveys of German POWs. Amongst the POWs taken in the summer of 1944, 90% listened to the Soldatensender, consenting that the musical entertainment was responsible for their interest in the station. Nearing the end of April 1945, MO began sending correspondence to the Thompson Agency to cease recordings for the Muzak project. And on April 30th, the Soldatensender terminated operation without a formal announcement. 2 days after the official Allied victory in Europe on May 8, 1945, General Donovan wrote to Lester O'Keefe, the Thompson Agency radio director overseeing the Muzak project, to offer his gratitude over the success of the operation. Quote, "With the advent of victory in the European theater, our Muzak project has been discontinued. At this time, I wish to express my sincere appreciation of your efforts in behalf of this operation. For 10 months, you contributed your time, energy, and experience as a patriotic service to the cause of winning the war. The fact that Muzak project was generally regarded as an excellent and highly professional recording job will give you, I hope, the same satisfaction that it affords me. In splendid cooperation with our staff, you helped us in producing a psychological weapon which played its part effectively, and I wish to tell you that this organization feels that much of the credit for the success of the Muzak project is due to you. With best wishes, I am faithfully yours, William J. Donovan, Major General, USA." End quote. The noted success of the Soldatensender propaganda music prompted the OSS to begin similar stations and music initiatives in Japan and other areas of the South Pacific following World War II. The Muzak initiative was evaluated through intelligence comebacks or captured enemy documents, interrogation reports of POWs, and interviews with civilians. The MO found that the black or subversive radio programs were particularly effective with the enemy civilian and military populations, and the United States Strategic Bombing Survey exposed that the programs were just as devastating to German morale as an air raid. Lyricist Lothar Metzel wrote in his final summation of the project before he entered the services of the CIA, quote, "An important conclusion may be drawn from the success of this operation. Muzak has proven the pulling power of professional entertainment in psychological warfare. Music has kept the enemy listening to Allied propaganda for 10 months up to the final stages of the European War, when Soldatensender West went off the air. But Muzak is only one step into a field that has not yet been sufficiently explored and developed. Professional entertainment can serve not only as bait for propaganda, if used properly, it can be made into propaganda itself and become a strong weapon of psychological warfare." End quote. The developments of the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War marks a turning point in how government agencies regarded the systematic implementation of music, crafted to elicit specific reactions in the service of total war. The OSS was disbanded in 1946, and morale operations methodology was incorporated into the new Central Intelligence Agency established in 1947. Lothar Metzel continued with the CIA as an analyst until his retirement in the 1970s, where he penned several analyses of Soviet Union propaganda and communism in the 20th century for the office, and is also noted for his work in Operation PB History in Guatemala in the 1950s. The Muzak project's noted success within the offices led to the use of similar propaganda tactics in future United States-sponsored clandestine stations, including the Voice of Liberation Radio in Guatemala during the 1950s, Radio Swan in Cuba during the 1960s, as well as Free Voice of Iran and Radio Quince de Septiembre in Iran and Nicaragua in the 1980s. The seductive art of the Muzak project, as opposed to the moral instruction propaganda in use before its creation, marks a turning point in how the United States government considered the importance of cultural warfare and popular music's capacity for weaponization. From the music and lyric revisions to the song's presentation on the Soldatensender Calais, the reworkings of Muzak became sophisticated weapons of a highly systemized psychological warfare. Capitalizing on the talents of Jewish, German, and Austrian immigrant artists, the United States Office of Strategic Services was fostering and developing a new, more strategic format for propaganda that would utilize popular music and inform international broadcast procedures for decades after. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm sure there are questions. If you need a moment to formulate, I certainly have one. Thinking about Charlie and his orchestra is a point of reference, so that Charlie and his orchestra was a German project that played covers, really, really good German jazz musicians playing covers of American jazz standards and singing them in English, mostly broadcasting to sympathizers in the UK. So there was Lord Haw was in the show was called Germany Calling, and so the idea was that fascist sympathizers in the UK could get news about how well things were going in Germany, and hear some really, really good jazz with the lyrics adapted. So there were lyrics talking about how fat Churchill is, and making fun of the Allied forces at that point. And apparently, but the music, the scary part is that the musicians were very good. It's really, really well performed music. So that starts in 1941. Do they know about that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that project is targeting fascist sympathizers in the UK, but yours is targeting Germans.
Yes.
Soldiers and primarily soldiers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so they did study that orchestra.
Okay.
So Roosevelt actually sent Donovan to North Africa to start studying German propaganda in 1937 was when that started.
Okay.
So by 1941, Donovan returns to the United States, has this incredible dossier where he studied all of the German propaganda, including music's usage, and starts to have meetings with Roosevelt and starts to talk about music's importance and the way that music can actually serve as a weapon potentially, and he cites Charlie's orchestra as potentially a reason as to why he wants to move in this direction with radio shows. So I'm not sure exactly at what point. I think it was mostly the political warfare executive, so the English, who thought, well, if we shroud the music even further, what else could we accomplish with this kind of subversive radio show?
Amazing. Okay, so Michelle, is that you? Oh, sorry. So do you want to collect questions or go one at a time?
One at a time is fine, yeah, okay. Otherwise I'll lose, yeah.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And it opened my eyes to something I'd never encountered before. I mean, even though I study music, I just didn't realize the extent to which music had been weaponized during the wars. And the first question that I kept on coming back to, because I'm a music researcher, and in my field, we do a lot of social scientific study of the effects of music, was when they were analyzing the effects of this program, what methodologies did they use? I mean, was it systematic or was it just anecdotal? So I wanted to understand that better. And then the second question I had is, I was just wondering how they could keep the station undercover for so long. And I'm imagining that technology has improved a lot so that might not be possible today, but I wonder if you know anything about whether this is still being done and whether it's possible to kind of camouflage stations like that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and your questions. Yes, and to your first question, sorry, can you repeat your first question for me?
Sure. I wanted to know more about the methodology.
About the methodology, yes, of how they collected these results. So they did. For the POW reports, they had a system of questionnaires that they would have the operatives ask. So they would, originally when they would bring in POWs, they would have a system of questionnaires for them to answer that involved more than this project. So they kind of received like a whole packet of things to fill out. But one of those forms was, what do you listen to on the radio? What are your music taste? What are you interested in? What did you listen to? And kind of also, once they kind of were able to summarize what those results were, then they'd go back and ask, how did that music make you feel? And so they had all of these questionnaires. They'd send the operatives in, they'd fill them out, and then they'd bring them back into the OSS, and they'd have several kind of psychologists out of Harvard, usually was primarily that group, analyze those responses and then come up with the placards that I showed. So these were kind of all the information was traveled around between the offices on these like kind of large placards. So they would come up with propaganda initiatives and then send these around to the different offices, whether that was OSS Washington or New York or London, Rome, Cassis, wherever they had offices located, they would receive these kind of propaganda initiatives, and how they wanted to time them additionally with any kind of ground movements or any other military movements. Additionally, they had a bomb survey that they did of German citizens, actually when they started to kind of move into the country. And so they took that bombing survey in, which included kind of what were the effects of the bomb raids on your person, on your family, what did you take for comfort, and kind of, so at some point that they started to ask about radio play. I do not have those records. I have not been able to find them, only the reports that summarize them in the OSS, but that would be a really interesting find to actually figure out how they looked at that bombing survey. Yeah. And then your second question, sorry, just if you don't mind remind me. How they kept it camouflaged the entire time. So they originally kind of kept the location of the station very well camouflaged in Milton Bryan. Milton Bryan's kind of a small area outside of London. It's not very populated. Originally, the building did have camouflage on it so that planes that flew over it wouldn't recognize it as any kind of large broadcasting tower. Additionally, everything that they had on the radio show was scrutinized by actual either Austrian or German emigres. And they kind of went through, and so even printed materials had to have umlauts and everything had to be just so that there was really no indication on any of these materials or in the sounds of these materials outside of the artists that were banished or exiled that would indicate that this was coming from the United States. So there were comebacks actually that came from the propaganda offices in Germany back to the soldiers that said, do not listen to the Soldatensender Calais. We don't know its origin. Please stop listening to it. But that was almost like pouring wildfire on it because then all of the troops wanted to listen to it, right? So even though they received that announcement to not listen to that station, and it was actually, I think they could, it was punishable. They could imprison them if they were found listening to an enemy station. But they didn't know its origin still. So they acknowledged that it wasn't something they wanted them listening to, but there was no way they could determine where it was coming from.
Okay.
Do you have any information? I mean, if you don't have it, it's okay, but I'm just curious about whether this is still being done, whether it's possible for it to be done today.
So there is a podcast out right now called The Wind of Change. Yeah, and it's about the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Scorpions recording of the song Wind of Change and how potentially that song was initially kind of created by the CIA for the Scorpions to sing. So part of that podcast is the journalist that's doing the investigation as part of that is interviewing former members of the CIA, and the woman he interviews, who they don't give her real name because I don't think she has rollback, which is where you're allowed to talk about your time in the CIA, she says that they cannot reveal what actually happened with Scorpions and that you cannot get that information from the CIA archive because even though that project's over, something from that project might still be in use today that could endanger operatives. So that was the answer she gave in that podcast, which leads me to think, and in that podcast they bring up some of this work, they touch on it very briefly. But that leads me to believe that some of these kind of processes are at least in some respect possibly still in use. From that podcast, what mostly came from their discoveries was that they were using music groups to move around personnel, right? You can hide a lot of people with a band, and everyone that has to travel around with a band like Motley Crue or Scorpions, like you can hide a lot of people in that crew. So that's kind of where that podcast went to, was that potentially it was a way to move personnel.
So good. I loved it so much. I listened to that during lockdown. It was
Same.
Yeah. Sorry, I got distracted. Yes. Oh, you have in the middle here? Yes, and then Paul will come to you.
Absent from any discussion has been that the music, let's talk about music. The African component of the music, the African American music is what became popular music. And I mean, we talk about rhythm, and that's what we mean. It's like we never say it, but it's there. Was there any theorization during the war by people using it about, there certainly was on the German side, they called it Judeo-Negroid music. I mean, that's what they called it. Mm-hmm. Was there theorization in the OSS about what was the implication of using African music?
Yes, so I can go back and play it, but I don't know if you remember the Hallelujah that I played.
Is that a Harold Arlen song originally?
I don't know who it is originally, but it's originally a gospel hit. They've straightened it. I don't know if I can play it again if you want to hear it, but they've straightened some of the rhythms out, so it doesn't quite register as a gospel song in some ways. So there was some discussion as they were making the music that they could not point to that it was a complete jazz radio station, that would reveal itself as a black or at least gray propaganda station, right? That was an indicator that it was coming from the United States or some kind of allied force.
And of course it was Jewish music. It wasn't, I mean, Harold Arlen was a cantor's son. And it's from the same show as Accentuate the Positive.
Ah, okay.
I believe so.
If it's that same song, okay.
Yeah,
I'll have to look that up.
I think so.
Okay.
Which sounds like Maimonides, actually. Yeah.
Well, thank you. No, that's really interesting.
Tim? Question from...
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I just have a sort of a historical question, which is about why J. Walter Thompson Company was asked to do this. I mean, on the one hand, it was the biggest ad agency in the world in this period. On the other hand, there's a lot of ad agencies that were producing radio shows. The networks were producing radio shows. There were independent production companies that produced radio shows. So I'm just wondering why it was J. Walter Thompson instead of somebody else.
Thank you. I believe it's connections to Donovan. So I'm not sure if it was a World War I connection, potentially, or a lawyer connection to the agency as well, because Donovan served as a lawyer in New York for, I think, about 15 years prior before he became the director of the OSS. So somehow he knew that by placing it in J. Thompson, that there would be, I think, a level of camouflage to it, that there was some kind of security within that organization, that they could have a black propaganda operation and hire these musicians through a dummy corporation. I think they were also one of the few companies that was willing to set up dummy corporations in order to hire artists to keep the camouflage of the project. I'm not sure exactly who was his contact within leadership at J. Thompson, but I know he had a connection to the agency. I'm not sure if it was during his time in law or during his time in World War I, but that's an excellent question and something that I should look up and find a definitive answer to, because he had a connection to that agency and felt safe in placing his black projects there, the projects that really needed to appear as if they were emanating from the country that they were aimed at. So I'm assuming that at some point he had some level of trust in that agency, but who that person was, who that contact was, and why is an excellent question.
And I think you had something, yeah, Paul?
Yeah, but actually, Angela asked the question, and I wanted to ask about the reception.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could share with us the nature of how you've undertaken this research, because it's really quite fascinating. I think people would love to know.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, sure. So a lot of these materials were classified until there was a large number of them declassified in like 1981, and then a much larger group of records declassified again in 2011. So I started to look at this project around 2014, and when I went originally to the National Archive to pull the files, when you take out the personnel files for the direct operatives on the project, the people that are in charge of each station, the people that are in charge of kind of actually making the music, when you take their files out, what's inside are a series of manila placards that are CIA pull reports. So they have numbers that you can then contact the CIA, and you can Freedom of Information Act and ask directly for that record. So once I made my way over to Washington, D.C. and realized that so many of the records I was seeking were gone, I started to look for alternate methods. So I went to all of these operatives' secretaries, and I found out all of their secretaries' names. And then I went to the personnel files of the secretaries, and that opened up a whole world. Because whoever cataloged the OSS records didn't think to look at the secretaries as a place to sanitize records, I think initially. There was a lot there, including receipt records of where all the money was spent, is how I can kind of ascertain how much they spent on each session. So that includes, so if you can do kind of forensic accounting with the receipts there, you can also trace who else they were contacting in the office. So that was an interesting way to kind of get at more inter-office memos, was the secretary network. Yeah.
And also thinking about how you started your talk talking about feminist methodologies, looking at the overlooked woman in the room who knows everything.
Yes. Yeah, because and their names aren't in the books. So in the intelligence history books, there's not you don't find the names of the secretaries. But if you want to do the research, it's through the secretaries.
It's fantastic. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.